So in the Milchama, it says that they defeated Midyan, captured all the spoil, and then Shlishi Pasuk, verse Yud Gimel, 13. Moshe and Elazar and the Nesiim. You want to know why specifically the Nesiim, the princes, they also went out to meet them. What's the significance of this? And Moshe Rabbeinu gets upset. He says, when he sees that, and Rashi says, why did they go out in the first place? Because they saw that Yisrael were going to take for themselves part of the spoils. They said that's inappropriate, so they wanted to stop them. The question is, why is that so important? Yes, it's embezzlement, it's putting your hand in the public coffer, public funds, but is that what's so important the Torah has to teach us in this context? And Moshe Rabbeinu gets upset. He goes out and he gets upset about something else. Gets upset with all the various officers because he says, you've allowed all the women to stay alive, which is inappropriate because these women were the actual ones who themselves had caused Yisrael to sin against Midyan. And this was the whole raison d'etre of this whole war, and you've kept them alive. That's completely inappropriate. And therefore says Moshe Rabbeinu now, obviously this is not in breach of Geneva Convention, but Moshe Rabbeinu says now you have to kill all the male captives, and any woman who is capable of relations with the man also has to be killed, perhaps above 3 years old. Anyone who's not, any women who are below that age, infants, mamish, they can be kept alive. And in addition, Moshe Rabbeinu says you should camp outside the camp for 7 days because you become spiritually defiled. And what actually refers to, we're told, it refers to anyone who killed a non-Jew, because that means you've come in contact with him, physical contact, and therefore you're spiritually impure. And Rashi, we're told, actually called Hireg Nefesh, it means killing them through a sword. Even if you didn't actually physically make contact with the dead body, but since you touched them through a sword, we're told here, in addition to what we'd already learned in Chukas, that renders you spiritually impure as regards these midyanim that you have slain. And since you've touched the sword that was used to kill these and was embedded in their body, so a graphic, then you're also spiritually impure. And that's the law we learn from here. And the question is, what does this mean? What is telling us? Did they not know this? Did we not already learn this in Chukas? That any dead body that has immaterial projecting from it, acquires a spiritual impurity thereby from coming in such contact. So why do we need it here? Then we have Pasuk Chaf Aleph, the famous Gemara, the famous incident. Elazar then instructs, Elazar, who's with Moshe, who's accompanying Moshe, he's the high priest, he's accompanying Moshe, and he tells Klal Yisrael additional set of laws regarding the impurity, the cooking vessels that they may have captured from Midyan, that they have become impregnated with non-kosher foodstuffs, and therefore they also have to be purified, cleaned in such manner as they absorbed the non-kosher food. They also have to be impure. If it came into contact directly with fire, then they have to be fired. If with hot water in the Kli Rishon, in the first vessel, same level of heat has to be used to extract, because whatever level of absorption of heat was used to enable the absorption of the non-kosher food is also necessary to enable its reabsorption out. And the question is, and afterwards also they have to be purified in a mikveh. And Chazal tell us, why is Elazar saying this halacha? Why is Moshe Rabbeinu not saying this halacha? And we're told, because Moshe Rabbeinu actually became angered, and as a result of having become angered previously with Klal Yisrael for them having been negligent in killing out the females of Midyan, as a result of this, Moshe Rabbeinu actually forgot temporarily, momentarily, his learning, his Torah learning, and therefore it required Elazar to instruct Klal Yisrael regarding these halachos. The question: what does this mean? What's this telling us? Why do we need to know this? Why do we have to expose Moshe? It's obviously telling us something. Yes, that person should not come to anger. Moshe Rabbeinu's anger, however, was surely justified. It was for a very extremely valid purpose. Nevertheless, one perhaps still is not is prohibited from anger. And then we have Hashem's instruction. Very interesting. We're told that Klal Yisrael now have to take the proceeds and they have to divide it. And we're told now, Moshe Rabbeinu sees an instruction that he is to give an accounting of all the spoils of the war, and he then is to split it up. Half to Yisrael, there, and half to the army. Half to the army. And then, consisting of the livestock, all the sheep, the cattle, the donkeys, and the captives themselves, human captives, take the full amount of all of these, split them into two in each category. Half will go to Yisrael as a whole, and half will go to the army. And then from that, Moshe Rabbeinu is instructed that you have to take a small portion of that and give it as follows. The army, their portion, they have to take 1/500th and give that to the priests, to the Kohanim, of their share. And Klal Yisrael have to take of their half, they have to take 1/50th and give that to the Leviim. So we want to understand what's this telling us. Why is this? We don't find this happen in previous wars. Sichon and Og, they were not instructed to raise these tithes, Trumas and Maasros. And the Psukim give a long listing of this accounting. Then after that, we have another incident, that the officers who had been actually scolded by Moshe previously for having kept the women alive, they come now with Moshe perhaps in something of a retort, a rebuttal maybe. They say to Moshe as follows. It's interesting, Psukim, it's a little bit difficult to get. There's a number of explanations what the Psukim are actually saying. They say as follows. They say to Moshe, we were responsible, whatever, for our charges, our fighting soldiers, and we never lost any. No one was lost. Perhaps meaning no one was lost physically, per the Ramban, or per Rashi, no one was even lost spiritually. No one actually sinned. None of our charges sinned. Perhaps they sinned in terms of Yehurim. Perhaps they had improper, impure thoughts. But nobody actually performed any immoral acts in this siege, in this campaign. And also, therefore, perhaps out of gratitude, V'nakriv is korban Hashem. Now we're bringing a korban. We are bringing a sacrifice to Hashem, consisting of what? What actually we're bringing? We're bringing all this jewelry that we've captured from these Midianite women. We entered their palaces and we saw they were adorned with all this jewelry, and we actually, per the Targum, we removed all the jewelry from them. We did not during this process set eyes upon them whatsoever. And now we're bringing this as a offering to Hashem, as perhaps an atonement even if we had impure thoughts. And Moshe Rabbeinu takes this from them and gives an accounting. It amounted to 750 shekels in weight, 16,750 shekel, which he took from these officers. And then the pasuk says the regular army soldiers went themselves and took from the spoils for themselves. And then finally Moshe Rabbeinu and Elazar go and take this offering of these jewelry, this gold and silver valuables, and they bring it to the oil moed, they bring it to the Beis Hamikdash as a reminder on behalf of Klal Yisrael. So how are we to understand this event? It seems to be something of it was never clear to me. It's like a cloud of sort of random events. Moshe Rabbeinu gets upset, they sacrifice a bit, then Hashem says bring it all, split it up, give an accounting, and then the officers come. So I'm trying to get some sort of order to understand what actually these events are telling us. Nadas Kenim asks a question, the Toysis. He says, in this campaign we find that all the utensils that they captured from Midyan had to be kashered, had to be boiled and cooked and grilled on a fire to actually kasher the utensils themselves. They had to be scorched. And yet, in the campaign against Sichon and Oig, we do not find that this process was required of the vessels captured. So what is the difference, they ask? So, two answers are given. The first answer given is because, in actual fact, in the former campaign, there were no really utensils, cooking utensils that were actually captured, because they were fought in the battlefield. Whereas in this campaign, they actually went into the Midianite houses and captured all these utensils. And therefore, the halachic question arose as to what was necessary to enable one to use them. That's the first answer. The second answer that's given is in this case, in the case of Sichon and Oig, these campaigns, they were actually territorial campaigns. And as such, in being territorial campaigns, there was a special leniency, a special entitlement. During the course of Yisrael's campaign of capturing Eretz Yisrael, they were allowed, actually they were not required to be bound by the laws of kashrus. Whether they actually did apply them or not needs to be seen, but they were not required. They were allowed to even to eat non-kosher meat products, kedile de chazire, they were allowed to eat. Botim Meleim Kol Tuv, they were allowed to eat anything, and these laws did not apply to that campaign. However, that Sichon and Oig, which was a campaign of conquest, territorial conquest, whereas the war against Midian was not such a territorial conquest, in which case these laws, this particular leniency did not apply, in which case that's why there was a need to kasher the utensils. That is the answer is given by the Rosh. That Das Kain, the Toysis did not bring that Rosh, which might indicate that he argues that he would not say that would be a valid difference, that there, Sichon and Oig was a territorial campaign with leniencies and this was not. So according to Das Kain, perhaps we have to understand what might be the rationale for that. So perhaps we can try to start to understand what's going on with this battle. Moshe Rabbeinu, we saw, he exits the camp when they approach and they've got all the spoils, and he severely scolds the officers for having maintained all the women alive. And he says, these are the women that enticed Klal Yisrael, that made them sin. So why are you maintaining these women alive? And we also saw that because of this, because he came to anger, he actually forgot the additional set of halachas, that these of kashering the utensils that had to be kashered. So perhaps one could say, what was, as my father-in-law pointed out, it wasn't just officers, it was actually Pinchas himself who was the leader of this campaign. How could these officers, who themselves were tzaddikim, with Pinchas themselves, why did they fail to execute these Midianite women? When they are aware that this whole conquest was one of atonement for the Yisrael, that they had sinned and fallen through the Midianite women, and now they're keeping them alive, is it not appropriate for us to be rid of them? So perhaps one could say that they said no, there's no requirement to. And why not? Perhaps because, first of all, Moshe Rabbeinu said, Heina. He pointed to each one and said, these are the ones, I can tell you, this is the woman that enticed this Yisrael, and this woman enticed this Yisrael, these are the ones. In which case, you're surely bound to put them to death for what they've done. So why did Yisrael not do that? Why did the army officers not decide to do that? So we could say like this. This is going to be a principle that's going to partly explain what's going on here. That first of all, there were many women who were captured. And some of them were not necessarily women who had enticed the Yisrael women. So perhaps there was a collection here. And maybe there was a large number of women, some of whom perhaps were obliged to be put to death and some not. And perhaps the officer said, listen, this is a whole group. And maybe, therefore, we're going to view them as a whole group that's been captured. And those individuals, yes, who had caused Yisrael to sin, perhaps they are now null and void. They're no longer of any significance anymore. They're part of this group that's been captured. What does that mean? And Moshe Rabbeinu says, no, that's not how you view them. A person, for example, does not become bottled, does not become nullified within a greater number of people. A person always maintains a fundamental significance. But maybe the officers are viewing them like this. They're saying, what was the essence of this campaign? The essence of this campaign was a spiritual resurrection, a spiritual re-empowerment of reasserting our spiritual status. That we were perhaps enticed, and now we're no longer, and we're now coming to rectify that. So saying like this, on a similar to, we find at the end of the campaign that they took, let's look at that, they took the jewelry that they had captured from the Midianite women, and they said, we're dedicating this to Hashem. And one could ask, is this really appropriate? That you should be dedicating this jewelry that is brought for the purposes of enticement of Yisrael, for purpose of sin, this you're going to dedicate to the Beis HaMikdash? Is that really an appropriate gift to bring? We're told, Esnan Zoino, that if one pays a prostitute something that is inappropriate to be brought as a korban, as a sacrifice, and it's readily understood why this is so inappropriate. So why would they think that this jewelry would be an appropriate gift to build for the Beis HaMikdash, to bring for the Beis HaMikdash? However, they perhaps felt absolutely on the contrary. You think, say they, that this is jewelry that is being used to entice. However, it depends who has the upper hand. If yes, this jewelry has a purpose that it can be used to entice, and it has perhaps a potential enticement, then yes, the fact that they have dedicated this jewelry for these impure and improper purposes renders it inadequate, invalid to be a sacrifice. However, let's say they imagine that this is going to be used to entice. Let's say, however, they would take this jewelry and say, we're going to entice this wall to sin. Therefore, this jewelry has been dedicated for the purpose of causing walls to sin, stones to sin, and therefore it's impure. No, you'd say that's not something that acquires any improper status, because we're dedicating something for a particular purpose that there's no chance whatsoever, it doesn't exist, sinning of a wall or some inert object, in which case you're having dedicated for that purpose has no meaning whatsoever. This perhaps is what the Anshe Tzava, the officers were saying, the holy officers were saying, that the whole idea of this campaign was for us to actually reset our spiritual clock, to re-identify with our spiritual level that we have attained over the last 40 years. That essentially these Midianite women hold for us no temptation whatsoever, as we have proved ourselves, in which case their attempt to take this jewelry and to use it to entice us is perhaps in some ways can be compared to attempt to entice a wall. And they're saying, insofar as that is true, this is not something that's been used that has really got any, there's no validity, there's no efficacy, there's no validity. There's no significance to the fact that they have dedicated this for this attempted purpose, which has got no practical ramifications whatsoever. There's no chance of us sinning through this, and therefore, since we've got the upper hand also, we've captured this, therefore they're completely null and subordinate to our holy intents, and therefore this jewelry in actual fact is something that can be used for a holy purpose. And on the contrary, that was what they sought to say, that was a statement they sought to make in dedicating it towards the Beis HaMikdash, saying we wish to give this as a gift to Hashem, because to connote the fact, to represent the fact, to signify and show for everyone the fact that yes, Yisrael have done tshuva, and this no longer represents even a spiritual threat. That doesn't mean we don't have to be vigilant the whole time, but essentially we have negated and nullified the spiritual hold that, the impure hold that they had, this Midianite women had upon us. Similarly, perhaps this is what they were coming to say as regards even the Midianite women. They were coming to say, why did they keep them alive? Because essentially perhaps they're saying these Midianite women no longer represent, yes, they were the ones that had enticed Klal Yisrael. However, perhaps their status has changed completely. Now they're part of a group. What does this group represent? This group represents women not that entice Klal Yisrael. They represent women that have been captured by Klal Yisrael. That is their whole essence. They have no independent possibility of functioning, and they have no independent possibility of causing us in any way to sin. In which case, their whole status perhaps has been nullified. And as such, we were entitled to keep them alive, because that old Midianite women who are able to entice Klal Yisrael no longer exist. For us, that no longer exists. And therefore, that is the significance of us having kept them alive. And Moshe Rabbeinu, however, did not accept that. Moshe Rabbeinu had said that this was perhaps the discussion. We said Moshe Rabbeinu, his departure from Klal Yisrael was also dependent on the war with Midyan, because he was saying, so to speak, that Yisrael, till they have fully fulfilled the mission to spiritually revive themselves, they are still spiritually compromised. They're dependent on Moshe Rabbeinu for their spiritual, inspirational levels. And says Moshe Rabbeinu, for the moment, you cannot confidently say that you have defeated Midyan spiritually, and therefore that these women no longer represent a spiritual challenge or risk. They do, says Moshe Rabbeinu, per Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore you ought to have disposed of them. Therefore Moshe Rabbeinu instructs them, yes, you have to dispose of them. And this perhaps is what's going on then with the instruction from Hashem. We have, so to speak, almost like this dialogue between Moshe and the officers, that on what level, to what level have we spiritually now revived ourselves? And Moshe Rabbeinu says, I'm still concerned that there is still a spiritual risk with which you have to deal, and which you cannot confidently say no longer exists, this spiritual risk. And they felt, no, we have in actual fact spiritually triumphed. And Hashem gives an instruction. He says, I want you to take this spoil, split it between Klal Yisrael and the army, and it should be dedicated towards Hashem. And the amounts that are given are corresponding very sort of, it sounds like part of it is given, a 500th to the Kohanim, we're told, to the priests, and the 50th portion of Klal Yisrael is given to the Levim. What does that mean? And perhaps this reminds us very much of Truma Meiser, and that's really what it's called here. Truma and a tenth, almost, it's the 500th and the 50th, which very closely resembles Truma Meiser that you give to the priests and to the Levim. And perhaps this was the instruction from Hashem, so to speak. The Moshe Rabbeinu, that you could ask, why was this instruction coming in? Why did Moshe Rabbeinu not take the initiative of giving from this Truma and Meiser? And also, why did we not have this in the campaign against Sichon and Oig? Why were they not instructed in Trumas and Meisers? And more than that, the obligation of giving what we normally find Truma and Meiser is something that grows in Eretz Yisrael, something that comes, that has a holy source, something that grows in Chutz La'aretz. When a person has produce that comes in Chutz La'aretz, essentially there's not a fundamental obligation to give Truma and Meiser. A person maybe is meant to, yes, give a tenth of his income. But there's nothing that goes to the Kohanim, to the priests. And this is something that was derived from, wasn't derived from Eretz Yisrael, didn't grow in holiness. But maybe on the contrary, this is what actually the message that is being perhaps articulated here by Hashem in this instruction. That this is the rectification that has been performed. that we have actually rectified the situation, almost, so to speak, retroactively. We've said like this: till now, it appeared that yes, we had succumbed spiritually to the temptations inside of midyan, to their having tempted and caused Klal Yisrael to sin. However, ultimately, Klal Yisrael had prevailed spiritually, and perhaps in prevailing, it's not just that they had rectified what was wrong before; they had actually showed that fundamentally, really, this is our true spiritual level. And these implements that were the spiritual weapons of midyan, in actual fact, have no potency against us and never ever had, essentially. What happened was a spiritual aberration. Essentially, they have no spiritual potency against us whatsoever. And ultimately, therefore, like we saw with the implements, that the jewelry that they were dedicated to Hashem, this also maybe is the message has been given here. That essentially these are things that now we can look at them as having emanated perhaps almost from a holy place. That these were things that we once thought, yes, Klal Yisrael are their means of making Klal Yisrael sin, but in actual fact, it's been revealed, we've seen that it's transpired that no, these are not some implements that could any way result in bringing Klal Yisrael to sin, in which case these are now artifacts themselves that can be dedicated to Hashem. But even more than that, these are almost like this is like a war that was waiting to be fought and to be won by Klal Yisrael. From day one, these were something that we were perhaps, Klal Yisrael, there was going to be maybe, yes, the slight fall, but we were always going to ultimately take this and draw inspiration from it to actually raise ourselves up to higher spiritual levels. And maybe therefore you could say this was sort of planted almost figuratively in Yisrael. It was something that was going to be taken and sort of sanctified, dedicated by Yisrael, used by Yisrael to rectify their spiritual level. In which case it is something that almost like grew within the spiritual possession of Yisrael, and therefore that is a statement that's almost being made that Klal Yisrael have to dedicate it like Truma Maisa to the Kohanim and to the Levim. But normally it's the same party that gives Truma Maisa. One person takes his produce and he separates from that both the tithes, the Maisa, and the Truma. Here we split it. The army themselves, they're the ones that give a 500 to the Kohanim, and Klal Yisrael give a 10th to the Levim. And this perhaps is drawing this distinction. Then why do we not say it's one whole composite? Why is it split up? What is it split? And this perhaps to a certain extent represents a nuance in this narrative. That who were those who were sent on this mission? These were 1,000 people from each shevet. They were perhaps the creme de la creme, the spiritual giants of Yisrael. They were the ones that were chosen, since this was a spiritual campaign. They were the ones that were elected to be the fighting representatives of Klal Yisrael. Therefore, there was sort of a question. In their having triumphed spiritually, are they truly representative? Are they the true representatives of Klal Yisrael? In which case, it's a campaign that was waged on behalf of the whole of Klal Yisrael. We're all equal in this victory. And perhaps this statement is sort of, and this was also the discussion between Moshe and his generals. To what extent have the generals themselves, has the army themselves spiritually triumphed? So a nuance in that is also regarding Yisrael themselves. That to a certain extent Hashem is saying split it up. There are two camps here. On the one hand, there is the army, and they have triumphed. They are the spiritual victors here. On the other hand, they also represent Klal Yisrael. And Klal Yisrael also, therefore, they're coming from the strength of Klal Yisrael. Like Bilam had sought to say, the 600,000 represents really the spiritual potency of Klal Yisrael as a spiritual whole. But to a certain extent, this spiritual victory is still, there's a debate. It's not clear. It's not 100%. There's still always going to be some room for doubt. And that perhaps is the nuance that expresses itself here. Hashem says, split it into two. The group of the actual fighters, they will take their half. Because they have had more of a resounding spiritual victory, and therefore they should take their portion and they should actually dedicate it directly to the Kohanim. It is completely holy. Something that goes to the Kohanim is holy, and no one else is allowed to partake of it. No Yisrael. The half of Yisrael, they have also, perhaps that also represents some form of spiritual vindication, but not 100%. And therefore that should be given, it's got a slightly lower spiritual level, that will be given to the Levim. And the term used, there's an interesting terminology. It's used when it describes, Hashem says, when you give it to those waging war in the two groups. So it's described as like this. Hashem says, split the spoil between those who are hayotzim latzovo, those who go out into the army, uvein kol ha'edo. The ones who wage the war are described hayotzim latzovo. And they split it up, and the whole accounting have it split up. And then the half, and then the other half. The first half is the accounting that's given off of those hanoshim atzoivim, those from the yotzim latzovo, those who went out into the army. Those who, that's how they're described. Those in the army, those who fought, are described hayotzim batzovo. When it comes to counting the half of Klal Yisrael, that you should take that and also give a portion of that. So it says the Klal Yisrael which Moshe Rabbeinu split min hanoshim hatzoivim, from those who fought. It says which was split off. Klal Yisrael's half, which was separated from the army. The army in this context is not described as the yotzim latzovo. The half of Klal Yisrael that's split off is not from the yotzim latzovo. It's split off from the anoshim atzoivim, those who fought, went out and fought, the men who fought. So you might say it's just a linguistic perhaps nuance, but it doesn't have any significance. One might suggest that there is in actual fact perhaps a significance. As follows. You might say it's going into it's exploring this nuance, this balance. The yotzim latzovo, you might say, means as follows. Yotzim latzovo means they're the ones that go to the army. They're the soldiers. They're the actual soldiers. So when we're dealing with their portion, we view it perhaps as they are the yotzim latzovo. They are, so to speak, the only soldiers. There's no one else. They are true soldiers of the army, and thereby they are entitled themselves to a significant portion. And Klal Yisrael do not have any part of that portion. And not just that, since they are the only ones that were really, perhaps, spiritually capable of waging this war, in that capacity, they take a significant portion of the spoils, and also they are able to dedicate it to the priest, to the Kohanim. Having given that aspect of the accounting, one might sort of be left with the question, okay, so maybe Klal Yisrael are not entitled to anything. Perhaps they were not really equal to this spiritual challenge, and therefore not entitled to reap any of the spoils. And we say, coming back to that, no, we've got a different perspective. Klal Yisrael are also entitled. Why are Klal Yisrael, also entitled? Because those who went out to the army are, in actual fact, in truth, are also representing Klal Yisrael themselves. Why? Because those who went out in the army to fight, it's not just they are the army. No, they're the anoshim atzoivim, which means like this: essentially, everyone is the army. We're all the composite whole of the army, and also Klal Yisrael as a whole gives very much the spiritual inspiration for waging this war. And perhaps there were many in Yisrael themselves, as those who did not go to battle themselves, were fundamentally capable of waging this spiritual and physical battle. Just they were not the ones chosen. The ones that are chosen, they are the yotzim latzovo. They're the ones. They are the anoshim atzoivim. They're the actual ones who went out to do the fighting, but they're not the actual army. Everyone is the army. They're split into two sort of battalions in this army. There's the ones the anoshim atzoivim, the ones who actually do the fighting, and the ones who maintain perhaps the logistical and the spiritual fortification of the army. And in that capacity, when we're saying that's how we view the army, then yes, also Klal Yisrael also have an entitlement. The army is really representative of everyone, and in that context, Pasuk says Klal Yisrael are also fully entitled to a share, and also their share also is appropriate that of that a significant portion should be given for, also dedicated for a holy purpose, given to the Levim. Perhaps, yes, not quite on the same level as the Anshe Hatzova themselves, as the Yotzim Hatzova, but nevertheless, Klal Yisrael also share a part of this victory. Perhaps then, that is also the sequence of events that we have initially. Moshe Rabbeinu, we said, coming out after the war and being angry with those officers who had maintained the women alive. And we said, perhaps because Moshe Rabbeinu said, you're not perhaps on a sufficient spiritual plane that you could afford to maintain these Midianite women alive. And therefore he instructs them, they have to put them to death. And then we have the instruction from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that you should actually be taking part of this spoils and dedicating them to the Kohanim, which perhaps is a statement Hashem is saying, no, there is perhaps, we can see here a spiritual victory that would allow even the spoils to be given to the priests. And therefore after that what happens? The officers come back and they say, now we're bringing also an additional dedication to Hashem. We're bringing all this jewelry that we captured from the Midianite women themselves, and we're dedicating this to Hashem. And Moshe Rabbeinu willingly now accepts it. Perhaps this is their sort of rebuttal, their answer. They've sort of been vindicated to a certain extent by Kodesh Baruch Hu, saying, you are on a sufficient spiritual plane that maybe, yes, you should not have maintained these Midianite women alive, but nevertheless, you are spiritually triumphant to the extent that you're entitled to bring even these jewelry that was on the Midianite women themselves, that you are able even to dedicate to Hashem, because that in no way was, in this context, was used in any way to entice you to sin, because you had spiritually fortified yourself sufficiently that you were impervious to any such temptations. And perhaps also this is the significance of what Moshe Rabbeinu told them, that you also, Moshe Rabbeinu initially told them that anyone who has come into contact with a dead corpse of Midyan has to purify themselves. And there was a unique halacha that was learned here, a law that even if you touch through a sword, if you just touched a sword that impregnated a person, that also requires you to spiritually purify yourself once more, because you've received tumah, you become spiritually defiled through touching even just a sword. And this is the concept that cherev kecholo, that the sword that is embedded within the dead corpse, sorry for being graphic, but this is the halacha, that also imparts spiritual impurity. And what is this telling us? This concept, cherev kecholo, that the sword itself is analogous to the body itself. I also wonder, what's it telling us? Why is it that? It's firmly embedded in the dead body, perhaps. And therefore, it's considered attached to it. It's considered a yad. It's considered a part of it. That the tumah, the impurity, can emanate from it. Why would that? What's that telling us? So perhaps in this context, it's telling us as follows: that if a sword has become embedded, or an arrow, in the dead body, and the person then touches it, this arrow, this sword and the dead corpse are one object, are one together. Why is that? You might have said no. So I also used to think that since the sword, its whole purpose is to inflict death, to bring about the demise of this corpse, therefore it's that's where it's meant to be. Therefore that's why it's considered one with it. But I think the contrary is in actual fact true. It's not meant to be there. Where is the sword meant to be? It's meant to be there very temporary. It's meant to perform its act of slaying, and then you don't leave it there. The sword is not left in the corpse. One recovers, generally retrieves the sword and uses it for the next victim. It's meant to be there. It's meant to be in the dead body, yes, at the instant in which it's used. After that, there's no point in keeping it in the dead body. It has to be removed, and still it's an expensive, especially worked tool. It's going to be used for other campaigns. So why is it considered to be part of Why is it considered to be one together with the corpse? And one might say, on the contrary, this is what Moshe Rabbeinu is actually the message Moshe Rabbeinu is giving to Klal Yisrael. That, we said, why perhaps had they figured that they were entitled, the officers had been entitled to maintain these Midianite women alive? These were the Midianite women that had enticed Klal Yisrael. Therefore, it's not appropriate to keep them alive in this spiritual campaign, which is actually atoning for that very sin. Perhaps we said they had come like we saw in the last piece together with Pinchas and Bilam. That Pinchas, so to speak, in holding the sword over Bilam's neck, had, so to speak, had almost done away with Bilam. That effectively had killed Bilam. And therefore Bilam at that point was dead. And after that, had he allowed them to live, that would have been, so to speak, a sort of revival, a new Bilam. That was the dialogue between Bilam and Pinchas that we discussed in detail. And we said, similar here as well, that they felt, the officers of Klal Yisrael that waged the spiritual war, they felt that we had waged this war with such gusto, with such enthusiasm, with such commitment and dedication, that essentially these Midianite women for us are nothing. We essentially have killed them, they're knocked out. If we've sort of allowed them to survive, that's almost like MATOS MASEH. It's almost like we've sort of brought them back to life. For us, they're nothing. We had no qualms whatsoever about killing them. And therefore, if they are here anew, that's like they're a new people. They've been given a new lease of life. They've been allowed to live once more, in which case it's no longer the same. It's not like the same Midianite women. Moshe Rabbeinu was saying, hey, no, that is these women. Moshe Rabbeinu is coming to counter that claim. But they were saying, no, these are no longer the same people. They have no hold over us whatsoever. We essentially have done away with them. We were no bars. We had no sentiment whatsoever. Nothing was compelling us to maintain them alive. Therefore, that's why we felt ultimately we were entitled perhaps to keep them alive. And Moshe Rabbeinu was countering that, saying, no, you have not, I think you have actually been biased and you've had some form of sentiment. You've not completely eradicated the spiritual challenge. And therefore, you should not have maintained them alive. And perhaps, as Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, the sword, so to speak, this is symbolically illustrated by the Chorev Chalak Kecholo. When you have slain some of the midyan with your swords. So perhaps your sword, so to speak, you're like universal, peace-loving individuals. You do not believe in war. That's really what you're saying. So yes, you're soldiers, you've had to go to war, and you've had to actually kill soldiers from the enemy. And when you embedded your swords or your arrows in the enemy, basically you said to yourself, says Moshe Rabbeinu, he said, that's good. That's enough. I've done my duty, I've killed someone, I'm never going to do this again. A person might very well say that. When he sees a fellow human being he has to kill in the context of war, it's probably a very traumatic event, it's a fellow human being helpless, so he'll say, I'm never going to do this again. And symbolically it's saying, okay, this sword that I have now embedded in this victim of mine is never going to be removed. I'm never going to take the sword back. I'm never going to touch a sword again. I'm never going to conduct any act of war again, an act of violence against a fellow human being whatsoever. Says Moshe Rabbeinu, I suspect that has been what is going through your minds. And therefore, you view these swords as sort of they're embedded in these victims, they're never going to leave them. You're never going to take them back, you're never going to use them again to kill someone else. Says Moshe Rabbeinu, that is an improper thought. Because that's not the way you wage war on behalf of Hashem here in reclaiming your spiritual entitlement. But because I suspect, as Moshe Rabbeinu, that you have faltered, therefore I'm reminding you that yes, there is that always danger. Cherv kecholol. A sword is like the dead body itself, that a person has a certain reticence, a certain sentiment towards his enemies. Therefore, says Moshe Rabbeinu, this is the proof, this is sort of goes together with this narrative that you are to a certain extent still identifying with midyan. And that can explain why we have to have this parsha, this law of Cherev Kecholo, learned here. We already had it in Parsha of Chukas, Bachalal Cherev. So why is Moshe Rabbeinu repeating it? And why did they not learn it? Why did they not realize this themselves perhaps? The midyan, the officers of Klal Yisrael from the previous campaign, from the previous parsha, because they said maybe that's talking about Yisrael. Yes, when you implant a sword on Yisrael, there's definitely going to be an element of Cherev Kecholo. You're going to leave that sword there, you're never going to take that sword back. You're never going to touch a sword again. Therefore, he's effectively going to say this sword there's never going to be violence perpetrated against another Jew, perhaps. But when it comes to the Goyim, a person might have said, no, we're going to use the sword again, we have no problem. This was temporarily inserted, we're taking it out, and therefore touching the sword is not like touching the sword, it's not got the status of the corpse itself. That was perhaps the necessity to clarify this. And after that we saw, just finishing up the points that we mentioned here, we had that Elazar then comes along and instructs Klal Yisrael regarding the laws of purifying, kashering the cooking utensils that had become spiritual, that were contained the impure food, non-kosher food. It had to be kashered. And we said, how did Moshe Rabbeinu himself not become aware? Why was he not aware of these laws? Because his anger had brought him to sin. We said, had brought him to forget his Torah. And how could that happen? So you could say, first of all, even though Moshe Rabbeinu was doing this for an appropriate purpose, he got angry because he was actually spiritually chastising them and reminding them of the spiritual duty. So why would that be a reason to Moshe Rabbeinu to forget his Torah? On the contrary, that should be a reason for him to remember his Torah, that he is actually lecturing them on here. So one could say, first of all, no, that the person is never allowed to. There's always a sort of there's a cultural sort of milieu, a cultural sort of idea that a person should always be expressed in their emotions. It's healthy, and that's appropriate for a person to express their emotions. But perhaps the Torah attitude is not always and not absolutely. Yes, emotions perhaps have to be released and have to be also directed and can be used positively. Love, hate, anger, giving, everything, yes, has its place. However, a person also has to remember that ultimately there has to be a Torah base for everything. One can never get carried away with one's emotions, even if they seem to be the most appropriate whatsoever. This perhaps is the lesson that Moshe Rabbeinu is teaching them. Perhaps Moshe Rabbeinu, on the contrary, wanted to illustrate this lesson. That I became angry, and look, my Torah got forgotten. Why? Because at the base of a person, there is always going to be a danger of a sort of an emptiness. Even in Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore a person always has to maintain his guard and his spiritual fortification. He always has to be connected to Torah. He can never take an emotion, even if it's for the most appropriate purpose, and sort of go all the way. And that perhaps is the problem, I think, the mistake that society makes in condoning emotions. There's a lack of nuance. Emotions are important. They have to be directed and used and not necessarily thwarted and frustrated, but all within reason. Ultimately, they have to be directed and disciplined and controlled to a certain extent. That doesn't mean a person has to be a piece of stone. A person was given emotions in order to use them for appropriate purposes. But one can never get carried away. Even for the most holy purposes. You dance maybe in Simchas Torah. I don't know if you should be dancing. Even David HaMelech was dancing. Was he forgetting the Torah? Maybe. I don't know. I can't comment on the tzaddikim that always did these acts. But perhaps a normal person has to be very careful in going all the way. No. You always have to maintain a sort of a certain dignity, a certain intellect, a certain consciousness of what you're doing. That maybe is the first message. But we said, that's the Canim told us, why were the laws of kashrus of the utensils given here? Why were they not given in the law, in the campaign of Oig? And he told of Oig and Sichon, why were they not instructed regarding kashering the utensils? And he said two reasons. One was that was a logistical difference, that the campaign against Sichon and Oig did not actually involve taking any cooking utensils. Simply they fought the war and finished, where they didn't go into the houses to take the cooking utensils, whereas with Midyan they actually entered the houses of the Midyanites and took the cooking utensils, and therefore the question arrived. That was the answer that the Canaan gave. The Rosh gave a different answer. We said that the campaigns of Sichon and Oig were military campaigns, territorial campaigns, and there was a special head, there was a special dispensation. They were allowed to eat non-kosher products, whereas this was not such a campaign. One might say, perhaps on a deeper level, that was exactly the question. This was maybe what Moshe Rabbeinu actually, this was, so to speak, his mistake, what he forgot. That Could one say that this also campaign against Midyan was also perhaps entitled, this maybe was Tosfos was maybe asking in a deeper level, they were also perhaps a dispensation would exist even with this campaign. Yes, technically it's not a territorial campaign, but as part of the overall campaign the Klal Yisrael has to go through in order to acquire Eretz Yisrael, to come to their acquisition. They're going to have to also fight these spiritual battles, in which case this really is in a larger context, a larger perspective. This is a broader perspective. This is part of this campaign, in which case, as a necessary adjunct, they ought to have this dispensation that they're allowed to eat the non-kosher products. And this perhaps is exactly the question between the Das, the Kenim, and the Rosh. Is that how we might view this campaign of Midyan? Could we view it as part of the campaign of conquering Eretz Yisrael? Would it have this dispensation? Ought it to have it or not? One might say like this: Tzichon and Oigen, the conquest of Eretz Yisrael is a necessity. It's an absolute necessity, and therefore it is entitled that dispensation was given in fighting those wars that were a fundamental element and part of the overall conquest of Eretz Yisrael. However, this conquest, this campaign against Midyan was not part of the central campaign. It was an aberration. As an aberration that should never have occurred, therefore it does not entitle to that particular, to be viewed as part of the overall conquest. On the other hand, one could say no, it was an inevitable part of the dynamic that's going to be conquering Eretz Yisrael. We're going to have this type of situation arising perhaps as arose with Midyan, in which case, yes, it is an inevitable part of the campaign and would be entitled to this dispensation. And one might say, was that dependent on? This Gufus, depending on this nuance, this question between Moshe Rabbeinu and the officers. This fundamental question we've often been debating, discussing. Namely, it's inevitable that when Klal Yisrael are going to be fighting the nations and conquering, that there are going to be spiritual challenges, and it's very possible that some nations will seek to try and challenge Klal Yisrael spiritually and make them sin, entice them to sin, and thereby to weaken them. That's inevitable perhaps. The question is it inevitable that Klal Yisrael, can we expect that Klal Yisrael will falter, will sin, will be enticed, and thereafter will be required to conduct a spiritual re-fortification campaign to resurrect and correct what had befallen them? So I might say that depends, perhaps, how we view Klal Yisrael, their spiritual level. If we say Klal Yisrael, essentially, we'd expect them to be fundamentally, spiritually fortified and impervious and above these spiritual impure temptations, in which case we would not expect within the context of the conquest of Eretz Yisrael, we would not expect them to have these spiritual temptations and to falter and to have to fight wars, so to speak, to reassert their spiritual essence. In which case, if that's how you view it, then this campaign is not a campaign that this is not a campaign that is part of the regular campaign. It was an aberration. It was something that should have not happened. In which case, there's no entitlement to eat the non-kosher food products. However, the other view might have been that, no, this was perhaps an inevitability. There was an inevitability that they're going to falter spiritually and they're going to have to reassert themselves, in which case this is part of the general campaign, in which case, within this context, it might be permitted to eat the non-kosher products. And that might be also sort of the narrative regarding that point, question which arose regarding that point. And also it might have been saying almost Moshe Rabbeinu might have sort of conveniently almost sort of forgotten this point. Moshe Rabbeinu was saying, so to speak, the laws of kashrus I'm not going to talk about, because I'm telling you, says Moshe Rabbeinu, that this is almost like a regular campaign. I know that you're going to be sinning and you're going to have to reassert yourself, and that's why I'm being so strict with you in the requirements of expressing this spiritual healing, this spiritual revival, because I know that you're always going to be spiritually at risk, in which case this is part of the campaign. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu does not mention the laws of capturing the utensils, because Moshe Rabbeinu says it's not really relevant. Maybe you have this special dispensation. This is part of the regular campaign of conquering Eretz Yisrael. Whereas Elazar, the Kohen, comes along and says maybe to Klal Yisrael, no, this should never have happened in the first place. You've actually had to, and have successfully perhaps, reasserted your spiritual status and prowess. And in which case, and really this is something that should never have happened in the first place. You never should have faltered spiritually in the first place. In which case, this is not really, I'm not viewing this as part, inevitable part of the campaign for Eretz Yisrael, in which case you do not have this dispensation of non-kosher food. And says Elazar, now you have to make sure you purify the cooking utensils. And now the final point, you can say what happened. It says Moshe Rabbeinu went out. Initially, at the very beginning of the campaign, after the campaign had finished, Moshe Rabbeinu went out with Elazar and with the Nesiim, with the princes. And Rashi tells us, why did he initially go out? Because he saw Klal Yisrael were coming to take from the spoils. And we also saw afterwards, he went through the instructions Moshe Rabbeinu was given, separating the Truma, the Meiser. And then we had the officers coming and saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, we are dedicating the jewelry from the Midianite women, we're dedicating this to Hashem. And Moshe Rabbeinu takes it. And then what happens? Then we said, the people in the army, we have to focus on these final three psukim. It says Moshe Rabbeinu took the gift that the officers brought. He accepted it, seems to be, as a valid offering to Hashem. And then we have verse 53. However, what happened was the army themselves, the rank and file, the basic soldiers, Bozazu Ishloi, that's what Toys explains to us. They took for themselves from the spoils of the war, the implements, not the livestock and not the people, but everything else they took. And then Moshe Rabbeinu says, Moshe Rabbeinu took the zav, the gold, which refers to the gold that he had received from the officers, and brought it into Hashem as a reminder of Klal Yisrael. You could say, what's going on? What's this sort of sequence of events? Moshe Rabbeinu receives the truma, the gift from the officers. He makes a reckoning of it. Then the soldiers, we're told the soldiers, in between it starts this sort of non-connected event perhaps. They go and take for themselves the spoils, and then Moshe Rabbeinu brings, it sort of continues, Moshe Rabbeinu brings the Zahav, and he brings it Lifnei Hashem, in front of Hashem, as a reminder for Klal Yisrael, positive reminder of the merits of Klal Yisrael. So what's going on? So I might say, what's going on perhaps is as follows. That, we can understand it in light of everything we've learned here, that why did Moshe Rabbeinu and Elazar go out, and the Nesiim, why did they go out in the first place? Because they saw Klal Yisrael were embezzling the spoils of the war for themselves. And we asked, is this really a lesson in public government and in sort of appropriate behavior regarding public funds, not embezzling and appropriating public funds? Is that what Moshe Rabbeinu was concerned about? That's what he's teaching us here. He said you should not be taking any of these publicly designated funds. So I might say, no, this is not the message. Moshe Rabbeinu was concerned for something else. Because now we've seen the whole parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu said, these public funds are not stam public funds. These are funds that there's a potential that these are going to be used to dedicate as a sacrifice, each part with its unique laws. Some is going to go to Levim, some is going to go to the Kohanim, some is going to be brought perhaps as a sacrifice for the Beis HaMikdash itself, says Moshe Rabbeinu. Therefore, that's what concerned Moshe Rabbeinu. He said, that's why I'm not permitting anyone to take any of these spoils, because you're taking away the korban from Hashem, you're taking away a gift from Hashem. That's completely inappropriate. And that's maybe why the Nesiim also accompanied him. The Nesiim are perhaps also like the Nesiim were the ones who dedicated the temple. They dedicated the Mizbech, the altar. They were the ones that were party. They were looking for dedications here for the temple. And when they saw the Klal Yisrael, the sum of members of Yisrael were usurping these funds themselves, they said, you cannot take temple funds. That was what concerned them. And maybe this also can explain what's happening at the end. The officers dedicate this jewelry as a sacrifice for Hashem, and Moshe Rabbeinu, so to speak, accepts it. He's now accepted, he's sort of accepted to a certain extent the narrative of the claim of the officers that yes, we are free from sin, we have spiritually proved ourselves, and this can be dedicated as a gift to Hashem. And then what happens? So Moshe Rabbeinu takes it, and then the army, the rank and file, the normal soldiers go and take embezzle for themselves some of the spoils of the army, of the proceeds of the conquest. And what is that saying? Why do they do that? They are coming to make a statement, perhaps. They're saying, we can take this for ourselves, also ishloi for themselves. In other words, saying, this is not going to be dedicated to Hashem. This is not going to be a sacrifice for Hashem. They are sort of contrasting. The officers brought this, their portion, they recovered as a dedication for Hashem, and the soldier said, no, we're taking this for ourselves, this is not going to be dedicated for Hashem. And then, therefore, that maybe raised again the question, perhaps, these spoils are not appropriate to be given to Hashem, which represents, as we said, particularly this jewelry that had been recovered from the midyan, that represented very much the Klal Yisrael, that Yisrael had reasserted their spiritual level, proved themselves that they were on a sufficient spiritual level, that they would not falter anymore. They'd resurrected themselves spiritually from having been enticed by the Midianite women, and that was represented by the fact that these artifacts themselves, these jewelry of the Midianites can be dedicated to Hashem. This now raised the question. These soldiers who had taken for themselves now spoils are saying, no, this is not going to be dedicated to Hashem. Maybe it's not appropriate. In response to that, Moshe Rabbeinu goes one stage further, and he wants to emphasize, no, the gift I've received from these officers is going to be placed, not just taken, given maybe to the Kohanim or whatever. I'm taking this and putting it. They brought it. Zikaron lifnei Hashem. He brings it, mamish, into the Kodesh HaKodshim, puts it in the Beis HaMikdash. Very much saying, no, this is extremely to be accepted. Why is Zikaron lifnei Yisrael? There should be no question that Klal Yisrael perhaps are not on a sufficient spiritual plane as the act of the soldiers perhaps might have suggested. So Moshe Rabbeinu comes to confirm, no, Klal Yisrael are fully deserving of dedicating this to Hashem as appropriate sign that they have revived themselves spiritually, and therefore Moshe Rabbeinu takes it and emphasizes, no, this is going to have an extremely holy and complete dedication to Hashem.